The halls of Nexus Prime Military Academy stretched for miles in every direction. Built from stone that had been quarried from dead moons and polished until it shone like black glass. And Commander Vexthalen had walked these halls for 300 years, watching species rise and fall, watching empires crumble and new ones take their place. And in all that time, he had never once questioned the natural order of things. The Krillari were the strategists, their hive minds working in perfect unity to produce battle plans that flowed like water, and the Varathi were the defenders, their massive bodies and patient minds perfectly suited to holding ground against any assault. And the Sylphan were the shadows, masters of deception and ambush who could disappear into any environment and strike without warning. And these three species had dominated galactic warfare for 10,000 years. And everyone accepted this as simple truth. But now there were humans. Commander Vexthalen stood at the observation window of his office, watching the new cadets arrive for the autumn semester. And among the towering Varathi and the sleek Krillari and the ghostly Sylphan, there walked 12 small figures, fragile and soft and utterly unremarkable. And these were the humans from Earth, the newest species to join the Galactic Coalition. And Vexthalen did not know what to make of them. The Terran integration program was only in its third year, and already it had caused more arguments in the council chambers than any other initiative in recent memory. And half the council believed humans were too primitive, too violent, too short-lived to contribute anything of value. And the other half believed that every species deserved a chance to prove themselves. And so a compromise had been reached, and 12 humans would be allowed to attend the academy each year. And if they failed, then the program would end. And if they succeeded, then more would follow. Vexthalen clicked his mandibles together, a sound that indicated deep thought among his people. And he watched as one of the humans stopped in the middle of the courtyard, looking up at the massive statues of legendary commanders that lined the entrance. And this human was female, young by their standards, with dark hair pulled back and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. And her name, according to his files, was Elena Vasquez, and she was 22 years old. And she had scored adequately on her entrance examinations. And there was nothing special about her at all. The door to his office opened, and Instructor Kolveth entered, his 4 eyes blinking in the sequence that indicated displeasure. And Kolveth was one of the finest tactical instructors in the known galaxy, a veteran of 6 major wars, an author of 11 books on military strategy. And he had made his opinion of the human integration program very clear from the beginning. "They have arrived," Kolveth said, and his voice carried the weight of someone announcing a terminal diagnosis. "I can see that," Vexthalen replied without turning from the window. "The small one is looking at the statue of Grand Admiral Desix." Kolveth continued, and there was something like offense in his tone, as if the human had committed some kind of insult simply by existing in proximity to greatness. "She is a cadet," Vexthalen said. "She's permitted to look at statues." Kolveth made a sound of frustration and moved to stand beside the commander. And together they watched as Elena Vasquez finished her examination of the statue and continued walking toward the dormitory complex. And she was so small compared to everything around her, so fragile. And yet she walked with a confidence that seemed out of place for someone who should have been terrified. "She will not last the semester," Kolveth declared. And this was not hope or malice, simply what he believed to be an obvious truth. Humans are fragile. They break easily. They live such short lives that they barely have time to learn anything before they die. And their species has not even achieved faster than light travel independently. They were given the technology by the Varathi as part of their integration. They have contributed nothing original to galactic civilization. Vexthalen considered this, and he could not argue with the facts, and yet something about the way the human had looked at the statue bothered him. Something about the expression on her face. Not awe or intimidation, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like recognition. The council approved their inclusion, Vexthalen finally said. We shall see what they bring. Down in the dormitory, Elena Vasquez unpacked her single bag of belongings into a room that had clearly been designed for someone 3 times her size. And the bed was so large she could have fit her entire family on it, and the desk came up to her chest. And she would need to find something to stand on if she wanted to use the bathroom mirror. But none of this seemed to bother her at all. Her roommate arrived an hour later, a sylphin named Thesara, who materialized in the doorway like smoke taking form. And Thesara's skin shifted colors constantly, adapting to her environment. And her eyes were large and dark and utterly unreadable. And she looked at Elena for a long moment without speaking. You are the human, Thesara finally said. And it was not a question. I am a human, Elena agreed, smiling. There are 12 of us. So technically, I am one of several humans. But yes, human is accurate. Thesara tilted her head in a gesture that might have indicated confusion or curiosity or contempt. And then she moved to her side of the room and began unpacking her own belongings. And Elena watched her for a moment before returning to her own unpacking. I have read about your species, Thesara said without looking up. You are very young, and your history is very violent. And most of the council believes you will destroy yourselves within the next 1,000 years. That is a popular opinion, Elena admitted. My grandmother said the same thing, although she thought it would happen sooner. Thesara looked at her then, and there was something in her dark eyes that might have been the first spark of interest. Your own family believes you will destroy yourselves? My grandmother survived 3 wars, Elena said. She was what we call a pessimist, which means she always expected the worst. But she was also what we call a survivor, which means she was very good at not dying. And she taught me that expecting the worst and preparing for it is not the same as giving up. Thesara considered this for a long moment. Your species is strange. She finally concluded. Elena smiled again. And there was something in that smile that Thesara could not quite read. Something that seemed to contain depths that should not have existed in such a young creature from such a young species. Yes, Elena agreed. We are. The first day of classes began the next morning, and Elena sat in the back of the lecture hall, surrounded by beings who could crush her with a wayward limb. And she smiled and took notes, and no one paid her any attention at all. And that was exactly how she preferred it. 3 months passed at Nexus Prime Military Academy, and Elena Vasquez remained unremarkable in every measurable way. And she attended every lecture without fail, and she completed every assignment on time. And her scores placed her firmly in the middle of her class, not exceptional but not failing either. And the instructors who had expected her to wash out within weeks found themselves confused by her quiet persistence. Instructor Kolveth taught advanced tactical theory, and this was the class that broke most cadets regardless of species. And the concepts were difficult, and the expectations were impossibly high. And yet the human girl sat in the back row every day and wrote in her notebook with a focus that bordered on obsession. And Kolveth found himself watching her sometimes, waiting for the moment when she would finally crack, when the pressure would become too much and she would admit that she did not belong here. That moment never came. The midterm examination was legendary throughout the galaxy, and cadets spoke of it in whispers, and those who had taken it before refused to discuss the details. And the weight of its reputation was enough to make even the most confident students nervous. And when the day finally arrived, the lecture hall was filled with a tension so thick it was almost visible. Lena arrived early and took her usual seat in the back, and she had a cup of something warm in her hands, a human beverage called coffee that she seemed to require for basic functioning. And she sipped it calmly while the other cadets filed in around her, and their anxiety was obvious in their movements. in the way they clutched their tablets and avoided eye contact with each other. The Krillari delegation entered together as they always did, their minds already linked in preparation for the examination, and they moved with the confidence of a species that had never once failed this particular test. And their collective intelligence was legendary, and they had produced more Grand Admirals than any other species in galactic history. The Varathi came next, massive and steady, their stone-like faces revealing nothing. And they were not known for creativity, but they were known for thoroughness. And they would approach the examination the same way they approached everything else, with patience and determination and an absolute refusal to surrender. The Sylphin materialized in their seats without warning, appearing from shadows that should not have existed in such a brightly lit room. And the Zara appeared beside Elena and nodded once in greeting. And in the 3 months they had been roommates, something like friendship had developed between them. Though neither would have used that word. "You are calm," the Zara observed. And there was surprise in her voice. "I studied," Elena replied. "And worrying will not change the outcome. So I choose not to worry." "That is logical," the Zara admitted. "But logic rarely defeats fear." "No," Elena agreed. "But coffee helps." The examination began exactly on time, because Instructor Kolveth valued punctuality above almost everything else. And the screens on every tablet flickered to life simultaneously, and the scenario appeared in crisp text that left no room for misinterpretation. The Siege of Kathrani Iva, historical battle that had been studied and dissected by every military mind in the known galaxy for over 4,000 years. And the details were familiar to anyone who had ever taken a tactics course. And yet, the examination asked something that most cadets had never considered. The scenario was simple in its description, but devastating in its implications. And a defending force of 10,000 soldiers faced an invasion fleet of 200,000. And resources were minimal, and no reinforcements would arrive. And the odds were so overwhelmingly against the defenders that most species would have simply surrendered. The question appeared below the scenario in bold text that seemed to demand an answer. D. Sarib. 3 viable strategies for the defending force to achieve victory and support. Each strategy with tactical RESONING 3 strategies. And that number was intentional, and in 4,000 years of examination history, only the most brilliant minds had ever identified more than 5 possible paths to victory. And the current record was 7, held by Grand Admiral Lessex himself, whose statue Elena had studied on her first day at the Academy. And that record had stood for 600 years. Instructor Kolveth walked the aisles as he always did during examinations, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. And he watched his students with all 4 eyes, and he could see the tension in their bodies, the fear in their movements. And he took a grim satisfaction in knowing that this examination would separate the truly gifted from the merely adequate. The Krillari worked in perfect synchronization, their collective thoughts producing strategies that had been refined over generations. And their answers were elegant and precise, built upon foundations that had been tested and proven countless times. And Kolveth nodded with approval as he passed their section. The Varathi wrote methodically, their massive hands surprisingly delicate as they outlined defensive positions and resource allocation. And their strategies were predictable but sound. And they would not produce anything revolutionary, but they would not embarrass themselves either. The Sylphans seemed barely to move at all, but their screens filled with text nonetheless, detailing ambush patterns and deception tactics that only they could truly understand. And their strategies relied on their unique abilities, which was expected but limiting. Kolveth paused behind the human girl. She was writing furiously, her stylus moving across the tablet at a speed that seemed almost frantic, and her coffee sat forgotten beside her, growing cold, and her eyes never left the screen, and her hand never stopped moving. And Kolveth watched for a moment, expecting to see panic. Expecting to see the desperation of someone who had finally realized they were out of their depth. But her face showed no panic at all. Her expression was focused, intense, almost hungry, and she wrote with the determination of someone who had too much to say and not enough time to say it. And Kolveth felt a strange unease settle in his stomach. Something he could not quite identify, something that felt almost like premonition. He moved on, dismissing the feeling as irrelevant, because she was only human after all. And humans were fragile and short-lived and contributed nothing of value. And whatever she was writing would certainly be inadequate. And he had more important students to monitor. The examination lasted 3 hours. And when the time expired, the tablets automatically uploaded their contents to the grading system. And the cadets filed out in exhausted silence. And Elena Vasquez finished her cold coffee and smiled at the Zara. And there was something in that smile that her roommate had never seen before. "How do you feel?" the Zara asked. "Like I ran out of time," Elena admitted. And there was genuine frustration in her voice. I had more to say. The Zara did not understand what that meant. But she would remember those words later when everything changed. When the galaxy discovered what humans could really do when asked to think about war. Instructor Kolveth settled into his office chair 3 hours after the examination ended. And the grading system had organized all submissions by species and preliminary score. And he had a cup of warm Keleth beside him, the traditional drink of his people. And he expected this grading session to take several days because he was thorough in all things, and he took his responsibilities seriously. He began with the Krillari submissions as he always did, because they consistently produced the highest quality work. And their collective intelligence was a marvel of biological evolution. And their 3 strategies were elegant and precise, built upon classical doctrine that had been refined over thousands of years. And Kolveth marked them with solid scores and moved on. The Varathi had produced acceptable work as expected. 2 viable strategies and one that showed creativity if not practicality. And their defensive-focused thinking was predictable but effective. And Kolveth appreciated their thoroughness, even if he found their lack of innovation disappointing. The Sylphan submissions were clever, but limited by their reliance on species-specific abilities. And an ambush strategy that required the ability to become invisible was not useful to species that could not become invisible. And Kolveth noted this in his feedback and continued through the Stacky reached the human submissions almost as an afterthought, because there were only 12 of them and they had consistently produced mediocre work. And he expected nothing different from this examination. And he opened Elena Vasquez's file with the casual indifference of someone performing a task they considered beneath them. His first eye blinked, then his second, then all 4 at once. The screen displayed a list of strategies. And the list did not end where it should have ended. And Kolveth felt his heart begin to beat faster as he scrolled down. And down, and down again. STRATEGY, once titled Scorched Orbital Retreat. And it detailed a complete evacuation of the planet's surface while destroying all resources to deny them to the enemy. And the reasoning was sound and the execution was brutal. And Kolveth had seen this strategy before in historical texts. STRAT TWO was titled Civilian Evacuation Feint with Counterinvasion, and it proposed using the appearance of surrender to mask a surprise attack on the enemy's home territory. And this was aggressive and risky, but tactically viable. STRATEGY3 was titled Diplomatic Fragmentation of Enemy Coalition, and it outlined methods for turning the enemy forces against each other through political manipulation and false intelligence. Koleth's hands began to shake as he continued. Reading STRATEGY4 proposed a biological contamination quarantine bluff that would make the planet appear too dangerous to occupy. STRATEGY5 detailed the destruction of resources in a way that appeared accidental to avoid enemy retaliation. STRATEGY. SIX outlined a transition from conventional military defense to asymmetric guerrilla warfare designed to make occupation impossibly costly. STRATEGY 7 targeted enemy command structure through psychological operations designed to create paranoia and mistrust. STRATEGY proposed something the human had called weaponized surrender, which involved surrendering in ways that would cause maximum long-term problems for the occupying force. STRATEGY 9 described infrastructure sabotage with delayed triggers that would activate months or years after occupation. STRATEGY 10 outlined economic warfare through supply line interdiction that would starve the enemy into retreat. Colveth stopped scrolling and stared at the screen, and his mind refused to process what he was seeing. And he returned to the top of the document and counted the strategy headers one by one. And when he reached 10, he kept counting. 11, 12, 13 strategies for turning the enemy's own weapons against them. Strategies for creating martyrs whose deaths would inspire resistance. Strategies for infiltrating the enemy with agents who would not activate for years. 14, 15, 16. 17 strategies for delaying until environmental conditions shifted in the defender's favor. Strategies for forming alliances with neutral parties. Strategies for creating kill zones through controlled territorial sacrifice. 18, 19, 20. Colveth reached for his caloth and missed, knocking the cup to the floor, and he did not notice because he could not look away from the screen. 21, 22, 23. Each strategy was fully detailed with tactical reasoning and implementation steps and contingency plans, and each strategy was viable, and several of them had never been documented in any galactic military text that Colveth had ever read in his 300 years of study. 24, 25, 26 strategies that combined multiple approaches, strategies that sacrificed everything for long-term victory, strategies that redefined what victory even meant. 27, 28, 29. Colveth's vision began to blur, and his hearts were beating so fast that he could feel the pressure in his chest, and his mind was screaming that this was impossible, that no single individual could produce this much original tactical thinking in 3 hours, that the examination had only asked for 3 strategies, and the record was 7, and this human girl had 30 strategies. Kalev stood up from his chair and immediately sat back down because his legs would not support him, and he reached for his emergency communicator with trembling hands, and he pressed the button that would summon Commander Vex Thalen. And then he pressed it again because he was not sure if it had worked the first time. The room seemed to spin around him, and he thought about Grand Admiral Vesix, the greatest tactical mind in modern galactic history, whose record of 7 strategies had stood for 600 years. And he thought about the human girl who sat in the back of his classroom and took notes and never asked questions and never drew attention to herself. 30 strategies. The human had produced 30 strategies in 3 hours for a scenario that the greatest minds in the galaxy had studied for 4,000 years. Colveth's vision narrowed to a tunnel, and the last thing he saw before consciousness left him was the number 30 displayed on his screen. And then his body slumped forward, and his head hit the desk with a sound that echoed through the empty office when Commander Vex Thalen arrived 20 minutes later, responding to an emergency summons that had repeated 17 times. He found Instructor Colveth unconscious at his desk, and he found a medical emergency in progress, and he found a datapad displaying an examination submission that would change everything the galaxy thought it knew about humanity. He picked up the datapad and began to read, and his mandibles clicked together in a pattern that indicated profound shock. And by the time he finished reading, he understood why Colveth had collapsed. and he understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The emergency medical team arrived within minutes and stabilized Instructor Koveth. And Commander Vexthalen stood in the corner of the office watching them work while his mind struggled to process what he had read. And when the medical team finally transported Koveth to the infirmary, Vexthalen remained behind, holding the datapad as if it were a weapon that might discharge at any moment. He read the examination submission again from the beginning, slower this time, forcing himself to understand each strategy in detail. And the more he read, the more disturbed he became, because these were not the thoughts of an amateur. These were the thoughts of someone who had spent their entire life thinking about war. The door opened and Admiral Chun entered, the human liaison officer who had been summoned from 3 sectors away. And she was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. And she had served in the human military for 40 years before being assigned to this position. And she looked at Vexthalen and then at the datapad in his hands. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble. "We have verified it 17 times, Vexthalen replied. And his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. Cadet Vasquez produced 30 distinct viable strategies for a scenario that our greatest minds have studied for centuries. And several of these strategies have no precedent in our tactical databases. And at least 4 of them represent entirely new categories of warfare that we have never documented." Admiral Chun closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, there was something in her expression that Vexthalen could not identify. Something that might have been pride, or might have been resignation, or might have been fear. "Where is the cadet now?" she asked. "She has been summoned to the inquiry chamber," Vexthalen said. "I thought it best to speak with her directly." They walked together through the halls of Nexus Prime, and cadets and instructors moved aside as they passed. And word had already begun to spread through the academy in whispers and rumors. And no one knew exactly what had happened, but everyone knew that something had changed. Elena Vasquez sat alone in the inquiry chamber, a vast room designed to intimidate those who were brought before the academy's leadership. And she looked very small in the massive chair that had been built for species 3 times her size. And she looked up when Commander Vexthalen and Admiral Chun entered. And her expression was not afraid but confused. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. And there was genuine uncertainty in her voice. The question said to describe 3 strategies, and I thought that was a minimum requirement. And I apologize if I misunderstood the instructions. Vexthalen felt his mandibles click together in shock. "A minimum," he repeated slowly. "Yes," Elena said, nodding. 3 seemed like such a small number for a scenario that complex. "I assumed you wanted us to demonstrate comprehensive understanding, so I tried to cover as many approaches as I could think of. But I ran out of time and had to stop before I was finished." Admiral Chun covered her face with her hand, and her shoulders shook slightly, and Vexthalen could not tell if she was laughing or crying. "You ran out of time," Vexthalen said. "I had maybe 12 or 15 more strategies I wanted to develop," Elena admitted. "Some of them were variations on themes I had already covered, so I was not sure if they would count as distinct approaches. But I thought it was better to include too much than too little. 45 strategies," Vexthalen said. And his voice rose to a volume he had not used in decades. "Potentially," Elena said. And she seemed genuinely uncomfortable with his reaction. "Like I said, some might be considered variations rather than original strategies. And I did not want to pad my submission with repetitive content. So I tried to focus on approaches that were meaningfully different from each other." Vexthalen sat down heavily in one of the massive chairs, and his exoskeleton creaked under the stress. And he stared at this small, fragile human who had just shattered every assumption he had ever made about her species. Admiral Chun finally spoke. and her voice was calm and measured in a way that suggested she had prepared for this moment. "Commander, I should perhaps explain something about human history that might provide context for what you have witnessed. Today," she walked to the center of the room and stood with her hands clasped behind her back. And her posture was military perfect, and her eyes were distant, as if she were seeing something far away. "Humans have been at war with ourselves, continuously for approximately 10,000 years, she began. "We have fought over resources and ideology and religion and territory. We have fought over pride and revenge and sport. We have fought over things we no longer remember and things we wish we could forget. And every generation of humans has refined the art of killing and being killed in ways that would horrify any sane species." She paused and looked at Vexthalen directly. "We have developed strategies for every conceivable scenario because we have lived every conceivable scenario. And we have won wars we should have lost and lost wars we should have won. And we have learned from every victory and every defeat. And that knowledge is passed down through our culture in ways that are so deeply embedded that most humans do not even realize they possess it." Vexthalen's mandibles clicked slowly as he processed this information. "Elena here is 22 years old." Admiral Chung continued. "She is considered academically gifted, but not exceptional by Earth standards. And she grew up playing strategy games designed to simulate warfare. And she read military history for entertainment. And she watched dramatized versions of our wars as recreation. And she is what humans would call fairly average among those who have an interest in tactical thinking." Elena shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I did place third in my regional war simulation championship," she offered, as if this somehow diminished her accomplishment. "Third," Vexthalen said faintly. "There were only 47 participants," Elena said quickly. "And the person who won had been competing for years, and I had only started that season. So third place was actually considered a good result for a beginner." Admiral Chun nodded slowly. "Do you understand now?" "Commander," she asked, "this cadet is not exceptional by human standards. She's not a prodigy or a genius or a once-in-a-generation tactical mind. She's simply a young woman who grew up in a culture that has been at war with itself for 10,000 years. And she carries within her the accumulated tactical knowledge of all those generations. And she does not even realize how unusual that makes her in a galactic context." Vexthalen looked at Elena Vasquez. This small, fragile human who had broken an examination that had stood unchanged for 4,000 years. And he felt something he had not felt in centuries. He felt afraid. "Your species," he said slowly. "You think about war constantly." Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "We think about survival," she said finally. "And for humans, those two things have always been the same." 6 months passed after the examination that shook Nexus Prime Military Academy to its foundations. And the galaxy was never quite the same again. And the ripples of what Elena Vasquez had done spread outward through the Galactic Coalition, like waves from a stone dropped into still water. The Galactic Council issued Directive 7742, human after 3 months of emergency sessions and heated debates. And this directive ordered a complete restructuring of military academy curriculum to incorporate human tactical philosophy. And instructors from across the known galaxy were required to study the concepts that Elena had outlined in her examination. And many of them struggled to understand approaches to warfare that seemed almost alien in their creativity and ruthlessness. The examination question itself was retired permanently, because no one could agree on how to grade a submission that had exceeded all possible expectations. And the Academy's leadership decided that asking cadets to provide 3 strategies was no longer appropriate, when they now knew that humans might provide 30 or 40 or more. Elena Vasquez graduated at the top of her class, not because she had outperformed every other cadet in every subject, But because the Academy literally could not grade her on the same scale as everyone else, and the grading committee spent 2 weeks debating what to do before finally creating an entirely new classification just for her, she was offered 17 different positions across the Galactic Fleet before she had even received her official commission. And admirals from species that had looked down on humanity for years suddenly found themselves competing to recruit a 22-year-old human who had never seen actual combat instructor. Kolveth recovered fully from his collapse, though he developed a nervous twitch in his lower left eye that activated whenever humans entered his classroom. And he continued teaching for another semester before requesting a transfer to the logistics department, where the work was predictable and the paperwork followed established rules, and no one ever submitted answers that shattered his understanding of what was possible. He told Commander Vexthalen that he needed a change of pace, but they both knew the real reason, and neither of them spoke of it directly. Thesser graduated alongside Elena and received her own commission in the Sylphan Special Operations Division. And before they parted ways, she asked Elena a question that had been bothering her for months. When you sat down to take that examination, Desara said, "Did you know what you were going to do? Did you plan to break the record? Did you intend to shock everyone?" Elena thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I just answered the question," she said finally. The scenario asked how a defending force could win against overwhelming odds. And I started thinking about all the ways that could happen. And once I started thinking, I could not stop, because there were so many possibilities. So many paths to victory that no one had considered. And 3 hours was not enough time to write them all down. Desara's skin shifted colors in a pattern that indicated deep thought. "How many strategies do you think there actually are?" she asked. "For that scenario, if you had unlimited time," Elena smiled. And there was something in that smile that Desara found both fascinating and terrifying. "I do not know," Elena admitted. "But I have been thinking about it ever since the examination. And every day I come up with new approaches, new combinations, new ways to turn defeat into victory. And I am starting to think that the number might be infinite. That there is always another way to win if you are willing to think creatively enough and sacrifice enough and fight hard enough." Desara remembered those words years later, when she watched Captain Elena Vasquez lead her ship into battles that should have been impossible to win. And she remembered them when she saw Elena's tactics being taught at military academies across the galaxy. And she remembered them when humans began to rise through the ranks of the Galactic Fleet faster than any species in history. Commander Vexthalen initiated a personal research project after the examination incident, dedicating his remaining years to understanding why humans, a species that by all measurable metrics should have destroyed themselves centuries ago, had instead become frighteningly effective at the art of war. His preliminary conclusions were submitted to the High Council in a report that was immediately classified at the highest level. And only a few sentences were ever made public. "Humans do not think of war as an aberration," he wrote. "They think of peace as a temporary pause between conflicts. And every human, regardless of profession or pacifist inclination, carries within them the accumulated tactical knowledge of 10,000 years of continuous warfare. And they have seen every strategy succeed, and they have seen every strategy fail. And they have refined destruction into an art form that we are only beginning to understand." The examination asked for 3 ways to win, he concluded. Humanity responded by asking why anyone would stop at winning only once. Admiral Chum kept a framed copy of Elena's original examination in her office until she retired. And beneath it she placed a small plaque with an old Earth saying that she felt captured something essential about her species. "Amateurs talk strategy," the plaque read. "Professionals talk logistics, and humans talk about what happens after you think you have already won." Captain Elena Vasquez commanded her own vessel within 2 years of graduation, faster than any officer in the history of the Galactic Fleet, regardless of species. And her crew was a mix of 12 different species who had all volunteered to serve under her despite the initial skepticism of their own peoples. They learned quickly that when their captain said she had an idea, the correct response was to secure themselves at their stations and prepare to witness something unprecedented. Because Elena's ideas had a tendency to rewrite tactical doctrine and leave enemy commanders staring at their displays in disbelief. The galaxy was vast and ancient and filled with species who had mastered the stars long before humans had learned to make fire. And these species had developed sophisticated military traditions over thousands of years. And they had believed themselves to be the masters of warfare, but none of them had mastered war quite like humanity, because none of them had practiced it so relentlessly against themselves for so long. And sometimes, in the quiet hours between battles and briefings and diplomatic negotiations, the old instructors at Nexus Prime Military Academy would gather together and share drinks and whisper about the day a human girl had broken their examination. And they would wonder with no small amount of fear what would happen when humanity truly decided to turn its attention outward. The examination had asked for 3 ways to win. Elena Vasquez had provided 30 and apologized for running out of time. And somewhere in the back of every alien mind was the same uncomfortable question that no one dared to ask out loud. What else were the humans holding back?